Sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the shadows when darkness seems to have won. In a small Arizona town where dust devils dance across forgotten highways and the scent of sage fills the dry air, a young girl's desperate cries for help would finally be answered by someone the world had taught her to fear. This is not just another story of survival. This is the account of how ancient wisdom and modern courage collided in one extraordinary moment that would forever change two lives and challenge everything. A broken community thought they knew about justice, family, and the true meaning of protection. What happens when the very person meant to shield you from the world becomes your greatest threat? And what happens when salvation comes from the most unexpected source? A man whose own people had been silenced for generations, yet refused to stay silent when it mattered most. This is Sarah's story. This is Joe's story. This is the story of how one act of defiance against cruelty became a beacon of hope that would ripple through an entire community, proving that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to look away. The old pickup truck rattled down Maple Street every morning at exactly 7:15, carrying Joe Begay to his job at the hardware store. For 3 years, he had driven past the weathered White House with its peeling paint and broken front steps, never thinking much about the family that lived inside. The Hendersons kept to themselves, which was fine by most folks in Clearwater, Arizona. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, a little privacy was sometimes a luxury. But on that Tuesday morning in late September, something was different. As Joe slowed down to navigate around a pothole, he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the unmistakable crack of a leather belt against skin, followed by a child's anguished cry that seemed to tear right through the morning air. Joe pulled his truck to the curb and sat there for a moment, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel. He was a man of 52, with silver threading through his black hair and deep lines around his dark eyes that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors. His grandfather had taught him that some sounds you never forget, and the sound of pain was one of them. Through the thin walls of the Henderson house, he could hear Frank Henderson's voice, rough and slurred even at this early hour. The man was already drinking, and when Frank drank, his 15-year-old daughter Sarah paid the price. Joe had heard whispers around town about the Henderson family, but whispers were all they ever were. People talked, but nobody did anything about it. Sarah Henderson pressed her face against her bedroom window, watching the Navajo man in the pickup truck. She had seen him drive by every morning for as long as she could remember, always at the same time, always alone. Her back burned where her father's belt had found its mark, and she could taste blood where she had bitten her tongue to keep from crying out louder. Frank Henderson was a large man, well over 6 feet tall and thick around the middle from years of beer and anger. He had worked at the copper mine until it closed down 5 years ago, and since then he had spent most of his time bouncing between odd jobs and the local bar. His wife, Margaret, had left when Sarah was 12, taking their older son with her, but leaving Sarah behind. She had promised to come back for her daughter, but that was 3 years ago, and Sarah had stopped believing in promises. The house itself told the story of their decline. What had once been a modest but well-maintained home now showed the signs of neglect and violence. Holes punched in walls during Frank's rages had been covered with old posters. The front door hung slightly crooked on its hinges, from the time Frank had kicked it in during a particularly bad night. Inside, empty beer cans littered every surface, and the smell of stale alcohol and cigarettes had seeped into everything. Sarah learned early to read the signs of her father's moods. She could tell by the way he walked up the front steps whether she should hide in her room or try to slip out the back door. She could gauge his level of intoxication by how loudly he slammed things around the kitchen, and she knew that on mornings when he woke up with a hangover and no money for more beer, she would bear the brunt of his frustration. The neighbors had learned to turn up their televisions when the shouting started. Mrs. Patterson next door would close her windows even on the hottest days. The Rodriguez family across the street would hurry their children inside when they heard Frank's voice rising. Everyone knew, but knowing and acting were two different things entirely. Sarah had tried to reach out for help before. She had gone to her school counselor, Mrs. Beaton Williams, with bruises barely concealed under long sleeves and careful makeup. But Mrs. Crust. Williams had made a phone call to Child Protective Services, and when the social worker came to the house, Frank had been on his best behavior. He had cleaned up, hidden the beer cans, and put on the performance of a concerned single father doing his best in difficult circumstances. The social worker, overwhelmed with cases and impressed by Frank's apparent cooperation, had filed a report noting concerns but no immediate danger. Sarah learned that day that sometimes the system designed to protect children could actually make things worse. Frank's punishment for her betrayal had been swift and brutal, leaving her with bruises that took weeks to fade and a lesson she would never forget about the cost of asking for help. School had become Sarah's refuge, but even there, she struggled to concentrate. Her grades had slipped from A's to C's, and she had withdrawn from the few friendships she had managed to maintain. It was easier to be alone than to try to explain why she could never bring friends home, or why she sometimes fell asleep in class from exhaustion. Her teachers noticed the changes but felt powerless to help. They would ask gentle questions about her home life, offer extra support with her studies, and sometimes slip her granola bars when they noticed she hadn't eaten lunch. These small kindnesses kept her going, but they couldn't address the larger problem that waited for her every day when the school bus dropped her off at home. On this particular morning, Frank was angrier than usual. The electricity had been shut off for non-payment, and he blamed Sarah for somehow costing him money. In his twisted logic, everything wrong in his life was her fault. If she wasn't there, he reasoned, he wouldn't need to buy food or worry about keeping a roof over their heads. He could spend his disability check on whatever he wanted, instead of pretending to be responsible for another human being. Joe Begay sat in his truck, listening to the sounds coming from the Henderson house, and felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. His own father had been a gentleman who taught him that strength was meant to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. His grandfather had told him stories of warriors who stood up for their people when no one else would. And here he was, a grown man with the power to do something, sitting in his truck while a child suffered just yards away. The Navajo tradition spoke of walking in beauty, of finding harmony and balance in the world. There was no beauty in what was happening inside that house. No harmony in a child's cries going unanswered. Joe had faced discrimination his whole life, had been told by some in this very town that he didn't belong, that his kind should stay on the reservation. But he had never let other people's prejudices stop him from doing what was right. He thought about his own daughter, grown now and living in Phoenix with children of her own. He thought about how he would feel if someone stood by and did nothing, while she suffered. Decision formed in his mind like sunrise breaking over the desert, clear and inevitable. Sarah watched through her window as the man in the pickup truck turned off his engine and stepped out onto the street. He was tall but not imposing, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had made peace with himself long ago. She saw him look toward her house, saw him straighten his shoulders, and for the first time in years, she felt something she had almost forgotten. How to feel. Hope. Frank Henderson had just raised his belt for another strike when he heard the firm knock on his front door. The sound was authoritative, demanding attention in a way that made him pause. Sarah crept to the top of the stairs, her heart pounding as she listened to her father's heavy footsteps moving toward the door. Through the thin walls, she could hear every word of the conversation that was about to change both their lives forever. She didn't know the man at the door, didn't know his name or his story, but she sensed that something important was happening. For the first time in 3 years, someone was coming to her door not to ignore what was happening, but to confront it. Joe Begay knocked again, and this time, Frank Henderson answered. Frank Henderson opened the door with the belt still in his hand, his face red with anger and alcohol. He was surprised to see the Navajo man from the hardware store standing on his porch. Frank knew Joe by sight. Everyone in Clearwater did, but they had never spoken more than a few words about plumbing supplies or garden tools. "What do you want?" Frank demanded, swaying slightly as he gripped the doorframe. The stench of stale beer and cigarettes wafted out of the house, mixing with the sharp scent of fear that seemed to cling to everything inside those walls. Joe looked Frank directly in the eyes, unflinching. "I want you to put that belt down and step away from your daughter," he said quietly. His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty, the kind of calm authority that comes from a man who has thought carefully about what he's doing and decided that it's right. Frank's bloodshot eyes narrowed with confusion and rage. "This is none of your damn business, Indian. This is my house, my kid, and my business. Get off my property before I call the cops." The threat hung in the air between them, but Joe didn't move. He had expected this reaction. In his experience, bullies always tried intimidation first, especially when they were caught in the act of hurting someone smaller than themselves. Frank Henderson was no different from any other coward Joe had encountered, except that this coward was terrorizing a child. "Call them," Joe said simply. "Call the police and explain to them why you're holding a belt and why your daughter is crying upstairs. I'll wait right here with you until they arrive." From her hiding spot at the top of the stairs, Sarah held her breath. She had never heard anyone speak to her father this way. Frank Henderson was a big man who used his size to intimidate everyone around him, but the stranger at the door seemed completely unimpressed by his bulk or his bluster. Frank's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "You don't know what you're talking about. I'm disciplining my kid. Parents have a right to discipline their children. This isn't abuse, this is parenting." Joe's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his stance, a subtle straightening that made him seem taller than his actual height. "I know the difference between discipline and abuse," he said. "I heard her crying from the street. I heard the sound that belt made when it hit her. That's not discipline. That's torture." The word hung between them like a challenge. Frank had been called many things in his life, but never a torturer. He prided himself on being a man who did what needed to be done, who didn't coddle his child the way modern parents did. In his mind, he was making Sarah tough, preparing her for a world that wouldn't be kind to her. "She needs to learn respect," Frank snarled. "She needs to learn that actions have consequences. She's been getting mouthy lately, acting like she's too good for this house, too good for her own father. Someone needs to teach her how the world really works." Joe glanced past Frank into the dim interior of the house. He could see the evidence of Frank's version of the world, the holes in the walls, the scattered beer cans, the general air of neglect and despair. This wasn't a home where anyone could thrive. It was a place where hope went to die. "The world doesn't work by beating children," Joe said firmly. "The world works by people standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves. And right now, that's what I'm doing." Behind Frank, a small figure appeared at the top of the stairs. Sarah had crept down far enough to see the stranger who was defending her. She was a thin girl, all angles and sharp edges, with long brown hair that hung like a curtain around a face marked by premature worry lines. Her left cheek bore a fresh red mark where Frank's hand had connected, and she held her arm protectively across her ribs. When Joe saw her, something shifted in his expression. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was a real child, hurt and afraid, looking down at the two men who would determine what happened to her next. In her eyes, he saw the same look he had seen in wounded animals, the desperate hope that maybe, this time, someone wouldn't walk away. "Sarah," Joe called up to her, his voice gentle. "Are you okay?" It was such a simple question, but it was the first time in years that anyone had asked it and really wanted to know the answer. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but Frank whirled around to glare at her. "This doesn't concern you." But Joe stepped forward slightly, positioning himself so that Sarah could see him despite her father's bulk. "Actually, it does concern her. This concerns her more than anyone else." Frank spun back around, his face twisted with rage. "You have no right to come here and interfere with my family. I don't care what reservation you crawled off of, this is America, and I have rights." The racist comment hit its target, but not in the way Frank intended. Instead of making Joe angry, it clarified things for him. This wasn't just about child abuse. This was about the kind of man Frank Henderson was at his core. He was the type who kicked down because it was easier than building up, who blamed everyone else for his failures, and who used his fists when he ran out of words. "You're right," Joe said calmly. "This is America, and in America, children have rights too. They have the right not to be beaten by their fathers. They have the right to be safe in their own homes. They have the right to someone stepping in when their parents fail them." Joe's words carried the weight of history, of his own people's long struggle for recognition and justice. He thought of all the times his ancestors had been told to stay quiet, to not interfere, to accept treatment that no human being should have to accept. He thought of his grandfather's stories about standing up to injustice even when the odds were stacked against you. Frank was beginning to realize that this stranger wasn't going to be intimidated or talked into leaving. Joe Begay stood on his porch like a mountain, immovable and patient. It was unsettling in a way that Frank couldn't quite articulate. Most people in Clearwater gave him a wide berth once they figured out his temperament, but this man seemed completely unafraid. "What do you want from me?" Frank asked, his voice losing some of its edge. For the first time, uncertainty crept into his tone. "I want you to put that belt away and promise me that you'll never hit Sarah again," Joe said. "I want you to understand that someone is watching now, and if I hear or see evidence that you've hurt her, I'll be back. And next time, I won't come alone." The threat was delivered quietly, but it carried more weight than any shouting would have. Frank looked into Joe's eyes and saw something that made his stomach clench with an emotion he rarely experienced: fear. This wasn't the kind of man who made empty promises. Sarah crept down another step, drawn by the sound of someone actually standing up to her father. She had dreamed of this moment countless times, but in her dreams it was always her mother who came back or a teacher who finally did something meaningful. She had never imagined that her salvation would come from a stranger, and certainly not from the quiet Navajo man she had only seen driving past her house. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Joe looked up at her again, and this time he smiled, a small, gentle expression that transformed his weathered face. "I'm Joe Begay," he said. "I work at Henderson's Hardware downtown. I drive past your house every morning on my way to work." "Why are you helping me?" Sarah asked, the question that had been burning in her chest since the moment he appeared at their door. Joe considered the question seriously, as if it deserved a thoughtful answer. "Because someone should," he said simply. "Because you deserve better than this. Because when I was your age, my grandfather told me that we all have a responsibility to protect those who need protecting." Frank listened to this exchange with growing frustration and confusion. He didn't understand why this stranger cared about his business or why Sarah was looking at Joe Begay like he was some kind of hero. In Frank's world, people minded their own business and left him alone to handle his affairs as he saw fit. "This is ridiculous," Frank muttered. But the fight was going out of him. The combination of his hangover, his surprise at being confronted, and something indefinable about Joe's presence had deflated his rage like air from a punctured tire. Joe sensed the change in Frank's demeanor, but didn't relax his vigilance. He had dealt with enough angry men to know that their moods could shift quickly and without warning. Frank Henderson was still holding that belt, still standing between Joe and Sarah, still very much in control of what happened next. "Sarah," Joe called up to her again. "Do you have somewhere you can go? Family members, friends, anyone who could help you?" The question broke Sarah's heart because the answer was so simple and so devastating.
"No," she whispered.
"There's nobody." Joe felt something crack inside his chest at those words. This child was completely alone in the world except for the man who was hurting her. No wonder she had endured this for so long. She literally had nowhere else to turn. Frank seemed to regain some of his composure at Sarah's admission. "See," he said to Joe, as if this proved his point. "Where's she going to go? This is her home. I'm her father. She belongs here with me." "Belonging somewhere and being safe are two different things," Joe replied. "And right now, she's not safe here." The conversation had reached a crucial point. Joe could see that Frank was beginning to understand the seriousness of the situation, but he wasn't sure the man was capable of real change. Some people, when confronted with their worst behaviors, found a way to become better. Others just became more careful about hiding what they were doing. Sarah watched the exchange between the two men and realized that her life was balanced on a knife's edge. Everything that happened from this moment forward would depend on what they decided, and she had no control over any of it. The powerlessness was almost as frightening as her father's belt. But as she looked at Joe Begay's calm, determined face, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, things might actually change. For the first time in years, someone had seen her pain and decided to do something about it. Someone had refused to look away. The question now was whether it would be enough. The standoff on the Henderson porch lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Frank clutched his belt like a security blanket, swaying slightly as he tried to process what was happening. Joe stood perfectly still, his presence both calming and unmovable, like a tree that had weathered countless storms. Sarah remained frozen on the stairs, afraid that any movement might shatter this fragile moment where someone was actually fighting for her. She had lived in a state of constant hypervigilance for so long that she wasn't sure how to process the possibility that things might actually change. "Look," Frank said finally, his voice taking on a wheedling tone. "Maybe I got a little carried away. Maybe I was having a bad morning. But this is between me and my daughter. We can work it out ourselves." Joe had heard this song before. In his years working retail, he had encountered dozens of men like Frank Henderson. Men who became apologetic and reasonable only when they faced consequences for their actions. They never changed. They just got better at hiding their true nature. "How many times have you told yourself that?" Joe asked. "How many times have you promised to do better, to control your temper, to be the father Sarah needs?"
The questions hit Frank like physical blows.
He wasn't accustomed to being asked to examine his own behavior, especially not by someone he considered an outsider. "That's not your business," he mumbled. But the defiance in his voice was crumbling. "It became my business the moment I heard Sarah crying," Joe replied. "It became my business when you opened that door holding a weapon you'd been using on a child." Sarah felt tears building behind her eyes at hearing someone call her father's belt a weapon. That's exactly what it was, but she had never heard anyone name it so directly. In Frank's hands, that strip of leather was an instrument of terror, used to control and punish and break her spirit piece by piece. Joe turned his attention back to Sarah, speaking past Frank as if the man wasn't even there. Sarah, I want you to know that what's been happening to you isn't normal. It isn't your fault, and it isn't something you have to accept just because he's your father. These words were revolutionary to Sarah. Her entire worldview had been shaped by Frank's version of reality, where children deserved whatever treatment their parents chose to give them. She had been told repeatedly that she was difficult, ungrateful, and deserving of punishment. To hear someone say otherwise was like learning that gravity worked differently than she had always believed. Frank's confusion was evident on his face. He genuinely didn't understand why this stranger cared about his family's business, or why Sarah was looking at Joe with such desperate hope. In Frank's mind, what happened between parents and children was sacred territory that outsiders had no right to enter. She's my kid, Frank said, as if this explained everything. I brought her into this world, I put a roof over her head, I feed her. Don't I have the right to discipline her when she gets out of line? Joe's expression hardened. Feeding and housing a child isn't a favor. It's the basic responsibility of being a parent. You don't get to hurt her because you provide the bare minimum of what she needs to survive.
The concept seemed foreign to Frank.
He had grown up in a household where violence was common, where children were expected to accept whatever their parents dished out without question. His own father had been handy with a belt, and Frank had turned out fine. At least, that's what he told himself during the rare moments when he bothered to examine his life at all. My father hit me, and I survived, Frank said, the classic defense of abusive parents everywhere. It taught me respect. It taught me that actions have consequences. Joe shook his head slowly. What it taught you was that bigger people can hurt smaller people and get away with it. What it taught you was that love comes with violence attached. Look around, Frank. Look at your life. Does this look like success to you? The words cut deep because they forced Frank to confront truths he had spent years avoiding. His wife had left him. His son wanted nothing to do with him. His daughter was afraid of him. He lived in a house that was falling apart, drank too much, and had alienated most of the people who had once been his friends. If this was what his father's discipline had prepared him for, it was a pretty poor advertisement for the method. Sarah watched her father's face as Joe's words sank in. She had never seen him look so uncertain, so stripped of the bluster and rage that usually defined him. For a moment, she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. What do you want me to do? Frank asked. And for the first time, there was something approaching genuine confusion in his voice, rather than anger. Joe seized on this opening. I want you to put that belt away and promise me you'll never hit Sarah again. I want you to understand that she's a human being, not your property. And I want you to get help, real help, with your drinking and your anger. The suggestion of getting help touched on Frank's deepest fears about himself. He knew he drank too much, but admitting that to a stranger felt like admitting failure. He knew his temper got out of control, but he had always justified it as righteous anger at a world that had treated him unfairly. I don't need help, Frank said automatically, but the protest sounded weak even to his own ears. Everyone needs help sometimes, Joe replied. Asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. My grandfather taught me that even the strongest tree needs good soil and water to grow. Sarah found herself thinking about Joe's grandfather, wondering what kind of man he had been to raise someone like Joe. Her own grandfather had died when she was small, but she remembered him as being gentle and kind. Nothing like her father. Sometimes she wondered if Frank would have been different if his own father had been more like Joe seemed to be. Frank was struggling with emotions he wasn't equipped to handle. The combination of his hangover, his surprise at being confronted, and the presence of his daughter as a witness to his humiliation was overwhelming. He felt cornered, but unlike his usual response of lashing out, something about Joe's calm authority was keeping his rage in check. If I put this away, Frank said slowly, holding up the belt, if I promise what you're asking, what guarantee do I have that you'll stay out of my business? What guarantee do I have that you won't go running to the police or social services? Joe considered this carefully. You don't have any guarantees, he said honestly. What you have is a choice. You can choose to be better starting right now, or you can choose to keep doing what you've been doing. But if you choose to keep hurting Sarah, I promise you that I won't stand by and watch. The threat was delivered quietly, but it carried absolute conviction. Frank looked into Joe's eyes and saw something that made his stomach clench. This wasn't a man who made idle threats. Why do you care? Frank asked, genuinely puzzled. You don't even know us. We're not your people. We're not your family. Why would you risk getting involved in something that could bring you trouble? It was a fair question, And Joe took a moment to consider his answer. Because someone should care, he said finally. Because when I was growing up, my grandfather taught me that we're all connected, all responsible for each other. He taught me that turning away from someone else's pain diminishes us all. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest at these words. She had lived for so long in a world where no one cared, where her pain was invisible and unimportant. To hear someone say that her suffering mattered, that it was worth risking confrontation to address, was almost too much to believe. My grandfather also taught me, Joe continued, looking directly at Sarah, that children are sacred. They carry the future in their hearts, and it's our job to protect that future, to make sure they have the chance to grow into who they're meant to be. Frank snorted derisively. Sacred. Right? You people and your mystical garbage. Joe's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. This isn't mystical garbage, Frank. This is basic human decency. Every culture in the world has some version of the same truth, that children deserve to be protected, not terrorized. The conversation had reached another crucial point. Frank could continue to dismiss Joe's words as foreign nonsense, or he could begin to understand that what Joe was offering wasn't just interference, but a lifeline for his entire family. Sarah felt herself holding her breath again. She had learned not to hope for too much, but she couldn't help imagining what it might be like to live without fear, to come home from school without dread, to go to sleep without worrying about what might wake her up in the middle of the night. Frank looked at his daughter, really looked at her. For what felt like the first time in years, she was so thin, so fragile looking. When had she gotten so small? When had that look of permanent worry settled into her features? He remembered her as a little girl, laughing and playing, full of energy and curiosity. What had happened to that child? The answer, of course, was that he had happened to her. His drinking, his rage, his complete inability to be the father she needed, had slowly worn away everything bright and hopeful about her, until what remained was this frightened, broken girl cowering on his stairs. For just a moment, Frank felt something that might have been shame. It was an unfamiliar emotion quickly pushed away, but it lingered long enough for him to understand that maybe, just maybe, the stranger on his porch was right about some things. What happens now? Frank asked quietly, and for the first time, he sounded less like a bully and more like a man who was genuinely lost. Joe sensed the shift in Frank's demeanor and pressed his advantage. Now you make a choice, he said. You can choose to be better. You can choose to get help. You can choose to be the father Sarah deserves instead of the father you've been picking. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Everything that happened next would determine the course of her life, and she was powerless to influence it. All she could do was stand on those stairs and hope that somehow, some way, the man who had appeared at their door like an answer to a prayer would be able to reach something decent in her father's battered soul. The belt hung heavy in Frank's hand, a symbol of everything wrong with their relationship. What he chose to do with it in the next few moments would determine whether this was the beginning of healing or just another false start in a long history of broken promises. Frank Henderson stared at the belt in his hand for a long moment, as if seeing it clearly for the first time. The leather was worn smooth from years of use, first as an actual belt and later as an instrument of punishment. Sarah's blood was probably still embedded in those fibers from the countless times it had found its mark. I don't know how to be different, Frank said quietly. And for the first time, his voice carried genuine vulnerability instead of anger or bluster. This is all I know. This is how I was raised. Joe nodded slowly, recognizing the admission for what it was, the first crack in Frank's wall of denial. Knowing that you need to change is the first step, he said. Nobody expects you to transform overnight, but Sarah can't wait for you to figure it out at her expense. Sarah felt a strange mixture of hope and terror at her father's words. She had never heard him admit weakness or uncertainty about anything. Frank Henderson was a man who bulldozed through life, certain of his rightness even when evidence suggested otherwise. To hear him acknowledge that he might be wrong about something fundamental was both encouraging and frightening. What would I need to do? Frank asked, directing the question to Joe as if Sarah wasn't standing right there. It was typical of their relationship. Frank talked about Sarah but rarely to her, as if she were more object than person. Joe glanced up at Sarah, then back at Frank. First, you put that belt away and promise both Sarah and me that you'll never hit her again. Not when you're angry, not when you're drunk, not for any reason. That stops today. Frank's grip on the belt tightened reflexively. The idea of giving up his primary method of control over Sarah was terrifying in a way he couldn't articulate. Without the threat of physical punishment, how would he maintain order in his house? How would he ensure Sarah's obedience? Then, Joe continued, you get help for your drinking. Real help, not just promises to cut back. And you learn other ways to handle your anger. Ways that don't involve hurting the people you're supposed to protect. The word protect hit Frank like a slap. When was the last time he had protected Sarah from anything? When was the last time she had come to him for comfort or guidance, instead of cowering in fear? He couldn't remember, and that realization was more sobering than any hangover. Sarah watched this exchange with fascination. She had never seen her father back down by anyone. Never seen him forced to confront his own behavior so directly. Part of her was terrified that his submission was temporary, that as soon as Joe left, Frank would explode with twice the usual fury. But another part of her dared to hope that maybe this time would be different. And if I don't? Frank asked, though he seemed to already know the answer. Then I'll be back, Joe said simply. And I'll keep coming back until Sarah's safe. I'll call the police, I'll call social services, I'll do whatever it takes to make sure she's protected from you. The threat hung in the air between them, but it wasn't delivered with malice. Joe's tone remained calm, matter-of-fact, as if he was simply explaining a natural law rather than making a personal promise. This somehow made it more frightening than any amount of shouting would have been. Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine fear of consequences. Most people in Clearwater either avoided him entirely or backed down when he showed his temper. The police had been called to his house before, but they usually just told him to keep the noise down and left Sarah to deal with the aftermath. This was different. Joe Begay wasn't going to be intimidated or brushed off. How do I know you won't just keep interfering in my life? Frank asked. How do I know this isn't just the beginning of you trying to run my family? Joe shook his head. I don't want to run your family, Frank. I want your family to be safe. I want Sarah to have the chance to grow up without fear. Give me that and you'll never see me again unless you want to. Sarah felt a pang at these words. As much as she wanted the abuse to stop, she also found herself not wanting Joe to disappear from her life entirely. He was the first adult who had ever stood up for her, the first person who had ever suggested that she deserved better treatment. The idea of him vanishing once her father made some promises felt almost as frightening as the current situation. Frank was struggling with concepts that challenged everything he believed about family dynamics. In his world, fathers were absolute authorities whose word was law. Children existed to obey and wives existed to support their husbands' decisions without question. The idea that children had rights that superseded parental authority was foreign and threatening. She's been getting mouthy lately, Frank said, as if this justified everything. Talking back, acting like she knows better than me. Kids these days don't have respect. Joe looked up at Sarah, then back at Frank. When was the last time you listened to what she was actually saying instead of just punishing her for saying it? The question caught Frank off guard. He couldn't remember ever actually listening to Sarah's words rather than just reacting to her tone or attitude. When she spoke to him, he was usually looking for signs of disrespect or challenges to his authority, not trying to understand her perspective. She's 15, Joe continued. She's supposed to be developing her own opinions, her own voice. That's not disrespect. That's normal human development. Your job isn't to crush that, it's to guide it. Sarah felt a rush of gratitude at hearing someone defend her right to have thoughts and feelings of her own. For years, Frank had treated any expression of independence as a personal attack, any disagreement as rebellion that needed to be beaten out of her. My father would have knocked me into next week for talking to him the way she talks to me, Frank muttered. But there was less conviction in his voice than before. And look where that got you, Joe replied gently. Look where it got your relationship with Sarah. Is this what you want? A daughter who's afraid of you? A daughter who'll leave the moment she turns 18 and never look back? The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Frank had never really considered the long-term consequences of his parenting style. He lived in the moment, reacting to each perceived slight or challenge without thinking about how his responses were shaping his relationship with his daughter. Sarah had indeed been planning to leave the moment she turned 18. She had fantasized about it constantly, imagining the day when she could walk out the front door and never have to come back. But now, hearing Joe suggest that there might be another way, she found herself wondering if things could actually change enough to make staying bearable. What if I try and I mess up? Frank asked, and the vulnerability in his voice was startling. What if I lose my temper again? What if I can't change? It was the question of someone who genuinely wanted to be better, but wasn't sure he had the strength or knowledge to make it happen. Joe recognized this as a crucial moment. Frank was opening himself up to the possibility of change, admitting that his current approach wasn't working. Then you try again, Joe said. Change doesn't happen overnight, Frank. But it also doesn't happen if you don't start. And every time you choose not to hit Sarah, every time you choose to walk away instead of lashing out, you're building new habits. Sarah watched her father's face as Joe spoke, seeing expressions there that she had never seen before. Frank looked uncertain, confused, almost childlike in his confusion. It occurred to her that maybe her father didn't know how to be better any more than she knew how to make him better. I'd need help, Frank admitted quietly. I'd need someone to tell me what to do different. Joe nodded. There are people who can help. Counselors, support groups, programs for anger management and addiction. I can help you find them if you want. The offer was generous, more than Frank had any right to expect from a stranger. But Joe wasn't just thinking about Frank. He was thinking about Sarah and about breaking a cycle that could continue for generations if it wasn't stopped now. Frank looked at the belt in his hand again, then slowly walked to the coat closet and hung it up on a hook inside. It was a small gesture, but symbolically enormous. Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. I promise, Frank said, turning back to face Joe and looking up at Sarah for the first time. I promise I won't hit you again, Sarah. I promise I'll get help. Sarah wanted to believe him, but promises from Frank had been broken so many times before. Still, something about this moment felt different. The presence of a witness, the public nature of the commitment, the specific steps Joe was outlining, it all felt more real than Frank's previous vague assurances that he would do better. Joe extended his hand to Frank, and after a moment's hesitation, Frank shook it. I'll check on you both, Joe said. Not to spy or interfere, but to see how you're doing. Is that okay? Frank nodded, though Sarah could see the effort it cost him to agree to ongoing accountability. For a man accustomed to operating without oversight, the idea of regular check-ins was probably terrifying. Sarah, Joe said, looking up at her again, if things don't improve, if he breaks his promise, you call me. Can you do that? Sarah nodded, tears finally spilling over. For the first time in years, she had someone in her corner, someone who would answer if she called for help. Joe reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card from the hardware store. He wrote his home phone number on the back and handed it to Frank. For emergencies, he said, and for when you're ready to start getting help. As Joe turned to leave, Sarah called out to him, Mr. Big A? He looked back at her expectantly. Thank you, she whispered. Joe's weathered face broke into a smile. You're worth it, Sarah. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. And then he was gone, leaving father and daughter to stare at each other across a chasm that might finally be bridgeable. The first week after Joe's intervention was the strangest of Sarah's life. She moved through their house like a prisoner who had been told she was free, but wasn't sure she believed it yet. Every time Frank raised his voice, she flinched. Every time he moved too quickly, she prepared to run. But the blow never came. Frank, for his part, seemed as bewildered as Sarah by the new dynamic. Without the threat of violence as his primary tool for maintaining control, he found himself at a loss for how to interact with his daughter. Their conversations, when they happened at all, were stilted and awkward, like two strangers forced to share a living space. On the third day, Frank surprised Sarah by asking if she wanted pancakes for breakfast. It was such an ordinary question, the kind that normal fathers probably ask their children all the time, but it left Sarah speechless. She couldn't remember the last time Frank had offered to cook for her or seemed to care about her preferences for anything. I don't know how to make them very good, Frank admitted when Sarah nodded. Your mother always handled the cooking. They stood in the kitchen together, Frank fumbling with the pancake mix, while Sarah watched nervously from the doorway. The pancakes came out lumpy and slightly burned, but Sarah ate them anyway. They tasted like hope. True to his word, Joe stopped by that Friday evening. Sarah heard his truck pull up and felt her heart leap with relief. She hadn't realized how much she needed to know that he hadn't forgotten about them, that his intervention hadn't been a one-time gesture. Frank answered the door without the belt in his hand this time. He looked tired but sober, which was notable since it was a Friday night. Mr. Trull, Big A, he said formally. Joe corrected gently. How are you doing, Frank? Better, I think. Different, anyway. Frank stepped aside to let Joe enter, and Sarah appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the sound of the voice that had become synonymous with safety in her mind. Joe looked around the living room and noticed immediate changes. The beer cans were gone. Someone had attempted to clean up the general clutter. The holes in the walls were still there, but they no longer seemed to dominate the space. Sarah, Joe called up to her. How are you doing? Better, she said, echoing her father's words. He hasn't. He's kept his promise. Joe nodded, but his trained eye caught things that others might miss. Sarah was still thin, still carried herself with the hypervigilant posture of someone expecting attack. Her clothes hung loosely on her frame, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she wasn't sleeping well. "Are you eating enough?" Joe asked her directly. The question caught both Sarah and Frank off guard. Frank realized with a start that he hadn't been paying attention to whether Sarah was eating regularly. In his mind, putting food in the refrigerator was enough. He hadn't considered whether she felt safe enough to actually consume it. "Sometimes I forget," Sarah admitted quietly. "I'm not used to being hungry. I'm not used to noticing when I'm hungry." Joe understood immediately. Children who live in constant stress often lose touch with basic physical needs. Fear has a way of overriding hunger, thirst, fatigue, everything except the immediate imperative to survive the next potential attack.
Frank, Joe said, part of taking care of Sarah means making sure she's eating regularly.
Not just having food available, but actively making sure she's nourished. Frank looked embarrassed. "I never thought about it that way. I figured if she was hungry, she'd eat." "When you're scared all the time, your body forgets how to recognize normal signals," Joe explained. Sarah's been living in survival mode for so long that she might need help remembering how to live normally. This was a revelation to Frank. He had never considered that his treatment of Sarah might have effects beyond the immediate bruises and tears. The idea that years of fear could actually change how her body functioned was both enlightening and horrifying. Over the next hour, Joe patiently explained concepts that should have been obvious but weren't to a man who had never learned healthy parenting. He talked about routine, about consistency, about the importance of making children feel safe enough to express their needs. He talked about the difference between respect that comes from fear and respect that comes from trust. Frank listened with the intensity of a student trying to master a foreign language. Everything Joe said made sense intellectually, but implementing it was another matter entirely. Frank's instincts, developed over decades of dysfunctional relationships, pushed him toward control and dominance. Learning to step back, to listen, to respond rather than react required constant, conscious effort. "I found some information about support groups," Joe said, pulling a piece of paper from his pocket. "There's an AA meeting at the community center on Tuesday nights, and there's a parenting class at the county extension office on Saturdays." Frank took the paper with obvious reluctance. The idea of sitting in a circle with strangers and admitting his failures was terrifying. But he had made a promise, and something about Joe's steady presence made him want to keep it. "Will you come with me?" Frank asked suddenly. "To the first meeting, I mean. I don't know if I can do it alone." Joe considered this request carefully. His goal was to help Frank become independent, not to become a permanent crutch. But he also understood that taking the first step toward getting help was often the hardest part. "I'll drive you to the first AA meeting," Joe agreed. "But after that, you go on your own. This has to be your commitment, not mine." Sarah watched this conversation with amazement. She was seeing her father admit weakness and ask for help, behaviors she would have thought him incapable of. Just a week earlier, it was disorienting but also encouraging. That first AA meeting was brutal for Frank. Sitting in a circle of folding chairs in the basement of the community center, listening to other people share stories of lost jobs, lost families, lost hope, it forced him to confront the reality of what his drinking had cost him. When his turn came to speak, he could only manage to say his name and admit that he had a problem. But he went back the next week, and the week after that. The parenting classes were equally challenging, but in a different way. Frank found himself surrounded by much younger parents who seemed to naturally understand concepts that he struggled with. Watching role-playing exercises where adults practiced active listening and conflict resolution, Frank realized how completely unprepared he had been for the job of raising a child. Sarah began to see small changes in her father almost immediately. Frank started asking about her day when she came home from school. He began eating meals with her instead of taking his food to his recliner. Most importantly, he started noticing when she seemed upset or worried and asking if she wanted to talk about it. The conversations were awkward at first. Neither of them knew how to communicate without the underlying threat of violence that had defined their relationship for so long. But gradually, tentatively, they began to build something new. Sarah's grades improved dramatically as the stress in her home life decreased. Teachers who had watched her struggle for years suddenly saw her potential emerge. She joined the school's literary magazine and discovered that she had a talent for writing poetry. For the first time, she began thinking about college not as an escape from her current life, but as a path toward the future she wanted to build. Joe continued his weekly check-ins for several months, gradually spacing them further apart as it became clear that Frank was committed to change. Sarah looked forward to these visits not because she needed rescue anymore, but because Joe had become something she had never had before, a caring adult who was invested in her success and happiness. During one of his visits, about 6 months after the initial confrontation, Joe found Sarah in the kitchen helping Frank prepare dinner. They were laughing about Frank's attempt to flip a pancake, which had landed on the floor instead of back in the pan. "Looks like I still need practice," Frank said, grinning sheepishly as he picked up the pancake. Sarah giggled, and Joe felt his heart lift. This was the sound of a child who felt safe enough to express joy in her father's presence. "How are things really going?" Joe asked Sarah later, when Frank was in the living room watching television. "Better than I ever thought they could be," Sarah said honestly. "He's not perfect, and sometimes I can tell he wants to get angry the old way. But he stops himself. He takes deep breaths, or he goes for a walk, or he calls his sponsor from AA. He's really trying." Joe nodded, satisfied. Change was rarely dramatic or complete, but it could be real and lasting when people committed to the hard work of becoming better. Frank had been sober for 8 months when he approached Sarah with a request that surprised them both. He wanted to write a letter to her mother, asking if they could visit. Not to reconcile, that ship had sailed, but to show Margaret that he had changed, and to give Sarah the chance to reconnect with her mother and brother, if she wanted to. "You don't have to decide right now," Frank said, "but I wanted you to know that I understand why your mother left. I understand why she took your brother. And I want her to know that I'm not the same man I was then." Sarah considered this offer carefully. She had spent years angry at her mother for leaving her behind, but she was beginning to understand that Margaret had probably been as afraid as Sarah was. Maybe even more afraid because she'd had another child to protect. "I think I'd like that," Sarah said finally. "I think I'd like to see them again." The visit, when it finally happened 6 weeks later, was emotional and complicated. Margaret cried when she saw how much Sarah had grown, cried harder when she saw the changes in Frank. Sarah's brother, now 18 and finishing high school, was cautious but willing to give his father a chance to prove that he really had changed. They didn't become a perfect family overnight. There were still tensions, still moments when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. But there was also something that had never existed before: the possibility of genuine relationship built on respect rather than fear. Joe's last official check-in came on the anniversary of his first intervention. He found the Henderson house transformed, not just cleaned, but truly cared for. The holes in the walls had been patched and painted. The broken front steps had been repaired. Most importantly, the atmosphere of fear that had once permeated every corner was gone. Sarah was now 16 and thriving. She had maintained her grades, developed friendships, and was already talking about applying for college scholarships. Frank had been sober for over a year and had become something he never thought possible, a father his daughter could be proud of. "I can't thank you enough," Frank said to Joe as they stood on the newly repaired front porch. "You saved us both." Joe shook his head. "I just gave you a choice, Frank. You're the one who chose to be better. You're the one who did the work." As Joe drove away for the last time, he thought about his grandfather's teaching about walking in beauty and finding harmony in the world. Sometimes that harmony had to be fought for, had to be insisted upon in the face of ugliness and cruelty. Sometimes it required ordinary people to do extraordinary things, like refusing to drive past the sound of a child's pain. 3 years later, Joe received an invitation to Sarah's high school graduation. She had earned a full scholarship to the state university where she planned to study social work. Her graduation speech, which she dedicated to "the man who taught me that I was worth saving," brought tears to eyes throughout the auditorium. Frank sat in the front row, beaming with pride at the young woman his daughter had become. Margaret and Sarah's brother were there too, family relationships slowly rebuilding. But Joe's presence in the audience meant something special to Sarah, proof that some angels come disguised as ordinary people who simply refuse to look away when someone needs help. In her speech, Sarah said something that Joe would remember for the rest of his life. "Someone once told me that children are sacred, that they carry the future in their hearts. Today, I want all of you to know that the future they saw in my heart is bright, because someone decided I was worth fighting for."
Joe Begay continued to drive past the house on Maple Street every morning on his way to work.
But now, instead of silence or sounds of fear, he often heard laughter floating through the windows. It was, he thought, a much better sound to start the day with. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to drive past someone else's pain, Sometimes being a hero is as simple as deciding that a stranger's child matters enough to get out of your truck and knock on a door. Sometimes the most profound change begins with the oldest truth of all, that we are all responsible for each other, and that nobody, especially not a child, should have to suffer alone.